Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. I'm really excited about this episode today because we have my friend and colleague from Defense Priorities, Dan DePetris. Dan DePetris is, in my view, one of the best experts on the Middle East in the Washington, D.C. area, ergo in the space for foreign policy elites, much better than most of them who have all these fancy titles and whatever. Because Dan's almost always right on these things, and it really cuts to the heart of what's going on. So that's why we wanted to have you on the show here to kind of explain some of the things that are going on in the Middle East right now. So welcome to the show, Dan. Welcome back. Actually, we've had you before.
Thank you, Danny. Very good to be here.
Yeah, so let's just jump right into it. So you published just yesterday a new explainer, the Defense Priorities, that's titled that the United States needs to withdraw from Iraq and Syria. And, that's going to raise some eyebrows because a lot of people are thinking, oh, yeah, hey, hang on, withdraw from the troops from Syria and Iraq. I mean, man, that we can't do that because, well, I mean, a lot of people don't know why. They just say that we can. It would be really bad if we did. But yet you're coming out and saying that. And the thing that really stood out to me is kind of your bottom line assessment. And Gary, if you could pull that up there, it says, you said keeping U.S. troops in Syria and Iraq is a high risk and no reward. The ISIS caliphate, the reason U.S. ground troops were deployed there in the first place, is destroyed. Whatever capability ISIS has left is no match for the pool of local actors who have the intent, interest, and capacity to combat them, whether or not the United States maintains a presence there. So I wonder if you can tell us, Dan, kind of when you say that we should withdraw, what is the prime reason why you think we should withdraw, and to what level should we withdraw? Should we completely leave all the troops out, or is it a kind of a phased withdrawal?
Right, and Danny, thanks again for having me on. As you know, United States has been in Iraq and Syria for the better part of a decade now. 2014, the United States began operations against the Islamic State. And the mission was very clear, and it was measurable, and it was achievable. And brass tacks, it was to get rid of the so-called caliphate, essentially roll back ISIS's territorial gains in both countries. And for all intents and purposes, we achieved that objective as far back as 2019, when U.S. forces, in combination with U.S. air power and local forces on the ground, particularly Shia militias and the Syrian Democratic Forces, pushed ISIS out of the last stronghold in Syria, along with a very small city called Baghouz in eastern Syria. And that was in 2019. As soon as ISIS lost its last patch of land, we won. We could have declared victory and left. We achieved our objective.
Left.
Right. But instead, we kind of just stuck around and raised the bar, and we're still there 4 years later.
Yeah, we have a clip here. I think if Gary can pull this up from Trump in 2020, just before he left, when he was asked, what about those troops in Syria? Why can't you withdraw those? Gary, if he can roll that, I'm kind of throwing a curveball to him. I know he's got to pull that up there, but he'll get it in just a second. But that just really underscores how we get stuck in some of these motions here, because Trump had some very.
He left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over.
We're taking the oil. We're not taking the oil.
Well, maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
I don't know. Maybe we should take it. But we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil.
So then you get into the situation there to where, why are we really there? And going back to your point about when we had an achievable military mission, there was this one comment by Obama when he first sent them in there that really is kind of starting to ring true right now. Let me see if you catch the end of this one.
The Pentagon says they're being hit by Iranian-backed militias provoking U.S. airstrike.
Sorry, Eric, I threw you another curveball. It's the one where Obama is talking.
We're prepared to send a small number of additional American military advisors, up to 300, to assess how we can best train, advise, and support Iraqi security forces going forward.
but he was quick to reassure a war-weary public that this is not the start of a major troop commitment.
I think we always have to guard against mission creep. So let me repeat what I've said in the past. American combat troops are not going to be fighting in Iraq again.
Well, it didn't turn out quite that way because, as you mentioned a minute ago, our air power certainly did. And we definitely had a lot of advisors up on the front line. I think some of them were actually firing artillery rounds at some point there. But this comment there, kind of in the middle there about, we always want to be careful with mission creep. Yeah, that's something we don't do very well because that was 2014. So that was 9 years ago. And we're still there with no even end date on the calendar.
Yeah, I mean, his point was dead on. We should always, regardless of what mission we're trying to achieve, mission creep is always a huge concern, regardless of what the objectives are and the force, the size of our force presence. And unfortunately, as we know, we didn't really follow that advice, did we? Obama sort of kind of disregarded his own very, very credible advice, and Trump actually expanded the U.S. mission to several different objectives that didn't have anything to do whatsoever with defeating ISIS.
Right.
So and now we're in a situation, essentially, especially in U.S. forces in Syria, where we have 4 or 5 objectives, and one has already been accomplished, our main objective, and the other 3 or 4 don't really matter a lick to core U.S. security interests in the region writ large.
Yeah, and that's really kind of one of the big issues of why I think you're saying that we need to withdraw. And I think the impetus for, correct me if I'm wrong, but the impetus for your publishing this right now is because of the risk to our troops is going up. Now, because of the Israel-Hamas war, that's just kind of supercharging some things, and that has resulted in some attacks on our troops recently.
The Pentagon says they're being hit by Iranian-backed militias provoking U.S. airstrikes in Syria early today.
Tonight, the Pentagon says Iranian-backed militia groups are at it again, launching another drone attack on a base with Americans, this one in western Iraq. There were no casualties. But it comes just hours after a U.S. show of force intended to stop Iranian-backed attacks against U.S. troops in the Middle East. The U.S. conducting 2 airstrikes in northeastern Syria overnight, and according to the Pentagon, hitting buildings housing weapons and ammunition. The Pentagon saying the facilities were used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. The U.S. says its strikes are designed to stop the attacks without sparking a regional war.
Yeah, that's the big issue, is it to try to avoid sparking an additional war. Gary, if you can pull up that map there that shows where a lot of these attacks have been coming in there. This was part of your explainer here where you're showing that these attacks have been really going on all over the place where U.S. forces are in both Iraq and in Syria. And I think it just underscores the danger to them. Now, as somebody who served in the armed forces, I can certainly confirm that we always are willing to put our life on the line for the defense of our country. But if the defense of our country is not at stake, then people need to answer, why do we want to put our troops' lives at risk if the core values are either already accomplished or are not even at stake? And one of the things you mentioned in this explainer here was that a lot of our core interests are not even at stake here, or are not helped by what I think you call the bloated infrastructure that we have in there. So I wonder if you can, first of all, just kind of tell us what do you think is the core interest of the U.S. in the Middle East, and how much force posture do we need for that?
Right. Well, in my opinion, I think the United States has 3 very, very broad interests in the Middle East. Number one is to defend against, anti-U.S. terrorism emanating from the region, which is a pretty straightforward proposition, and something that, the U.S. intelligence community, counterterrorism community have been focused on for the better part of 2 decades now. The second would be preventing a regional hegemon from emerging, because the last thing the United States or really any country wants is one country that essentially dominates the entire region, which, the Middle East, after all, still produces a significant amount of oil, crude oil, and also natural gas. The third interest is essentially to prevent disruptions to the international supply of oil. And that is actually it's been a core interest for the United States for a long time, certainly since the United States has been using the Middle East as a source of petroleum. Thankfully, we rely far less on the Middle East for oil now than we've done 20 to 30 years ago.
Yeah,
But
a lot of our
with that
domestic-
being said, oil is still a global commodity, so we do have to worry about price fluctuations.
Now, you suggested that we can accomplish those objectives with a lot less force posture that we have in the region. Gary, if you can throw up that map there that kind of shows really graphically that we do have a lot of troops in the area there. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, if we withdraw some of these troops as you're suggesting, will that enable us to continue to ensure those three goals are maintained in the region for our national interests?
Well, I think so, because when you look at a regional hegemon, for instance, emerging from the Middle East, that is a very, very low proposition. It's extremely unlikely, and the reason is because the Middle East local power brokers, principally the Persian Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, they do a pretty good job of balancing against each other. So even if the Iranians did exploit local dynamics after a U.S. pullout, you can bet that the Saudis and the Emiratis would not be sitting with their hands tied behind their back. They would respond pretty quickly and pretty significantly to balance even the possibility of Iranian expansionism. And
that's one of the other things that really stood out to me in your explainer was that you show how that there are actually dynamics in the region. It's not like as if the U.S. leaves that nobody else is going to do anything and Iran's going to be able to run roughshod over things. But let's actually talk about that part first. Let's talk about the Iranian piece first. How big of an actual military conventional threat is Iran in the region like that, and does that necessitate keeping a lot of troops there?
Well, Iranian conventional military power has been grossly overstated, in my opinion. Their navy is extremely small. They basically rely on speedboats and fast boats to harass larger tankers and ships in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Persian Gulf waters, which because you've been sort of studying this for decades. You have their army is untested. Their army has not fought a major conflict since the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, and they fought to a standstill, essentially losing close to hundreds of thousands of soldiers at least. Their air force is a mess because they don't have access to Western technology or enablers, and they're essentially relying on 1970s era airframes. And again, the Air Force hasn't been tested either. So really the only significant power that the United States really has to worry about is their missile program, which has been pretty well documented over the last decade and has made some pretty good strides in terms of effectiveness and lethality. And also their non-state network, which of course is their biggest trump card in the region. And they are willing to use it if their direct interests are threatened by the United States or anybody else.
But correct me if I'm wrong. It's in Iran's strong national interest not to get into a direct conflict with the United States. They want to work around the edges and be a nuisance, as Ed King at Defense Priorities says a lot. But they do want to avoid a direct clash with the U.S. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is a totally fair statement. Yes, because the Iranians aren't stupid. They if they measure up conventional power with the U.S., it's no match, and they would be smoked. So that's one of the reasons why they utilize their proxy networks to such an extent. And
so, given that, because I think it's interesting that while many people, at least in Washington, overestimate the balance of power and give Iran a lot more credit, I think that they're a lot more keen on what the actual balance of power is and how they're on the lower end of that. So they know if they get into a direct clash with the U.S., it's going to go pretty badly for them. But then that kind of leads into one of the other arguments that you make here that a lot of people in saying we shouldn't withdraw is they say, man, we cannot do that because it will cause a huge power vacuum in the area that others will flood in to fill. What do you say to those arguments?
Well, it's a lazy argument, in my opinion. And it's not an argument that is exclusive to the Middle East. Whenever the United States is thinking about drawing down, regardless of what region we're talking about, the so-called vacuum argument pops up. And it's inaccurate in my view, but it's also pretty powerful in terms of influencing policymakers in Washington, D.C. to maintain the status quo. And the reason I think the vacuum article is wrong, or the vacuum argument is wrong, especially in the Middle East, is because, like I said earlier, the balance of power is pretty well established. And in Syria specifically, that place is such a mess economically, politically, geopolitically, that anybody who would seek to fill a vacuum in Syria, it would seem to strike me as a burden on their shoulders rather than an asset. So the extent the United States can extricate itself from that situation, it would seem to me to be a pretty significant benefit, not a cost on our end.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I think that is not understood enough, that, you know, this so-called people filling in the vacuum is more of a burden than anything else. I mean, the idea that like China, for example, is going to come run there, or Russia is going to come fill it if we leave, and they're going to have all this influence. But I think that they would have more burden than influence. I'm not sure that would be good for either one of them.
Well, the Chinese don't want that. They've repeatedly stated out in public that they are not looking to replace the United States as the foreign, the foremost foreign power in the Middle East. And I think part of the reason is because they see the U.S. experience in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan throughout the last 20 years, and they don't want to go through the same story. And you can't blame the Chinese for being smarter than we were 20 years ago. So. And the Russian, in terms of the Russians, they just don't have the capacity or the capability to even remotely become a regional hegemon or a foreign hegemon in the Middle East. It's so absurd when I hear that argument. It's just so absurd. It's even difficult to even kind of
And you know what? I remember that argument was really raised a lot in the 80s when Reagan, who many of the Republican Party loved, when he withdrew forces after the terrible attack against the Marines, and I think the Kobar Towers. And he said, I'm going to withdraw, because at first everybody wanted him to go in more heavy. And instead he ended up, I think a year later, saying we're going to withdraw from there. And he took a lot of heat for it, and nothing happened. There was no vacuum that was filled by anybody else. None of our interests were, put at risk. Nothing changed in the area. We weren't in the area at all until 9/11. And, when we haven't left since then, but all during that time when we weren't there, our interests were taken care of perfectly fine. We didn't have any problem. And I think something similar would happen here, because the other thing you mentioned in this piece is that the regional actors will balance each other off there. So it's not like Iran gets a free hand if we walk out the door, because they also have, the Turks, the Saudis, and several others that also are, kind of pushing back and forth on that as well.
And we're seeing that play out right now in Iraq, where, the Iranians obviously have extensive experience and political relationships within elite Iraqi policy circles. And the Saudis and the Emiratis have devoted a significant amount of time and energy over the last 5 to 10 years trying to reestablish a strategic relationship with Baghdad, in part to balance Iranian influence in the country. So we're seeing that play out in real time. Certainly.
Now, before this, the Israel-Hamas war broke up, there was some move in rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. How was that going, and what's the current status of that?
Well, it's slow going, and you're right. The Iranians and the Saudis signed a détente, basically a reconciliation agreement, to kickstart the reestablishment of diplomatic relations after a 7-year freeze. And the Chinese actually brokered that agreement with vital assistance from the Iraqis. That process is still ongoing. It's been very slow, and that part of that is because there's literally no trust within Iranian and Saudi circles. And you're talking about a 7-year gap in relations, so it's going to take a considerable amount of time to mend those ties. And it's sort of interesting because ever since that agreement was signed back in March, I believe, the Saudis have been quite pragmatic. Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who essentially runs the kingdom's day-to-day affairs, he is pretty personally invested in this process. And a year ago, 2 years ago, you would have gotten MBS essentially equating the Iranians with the Nazis, and now you hear MBS on camera publicly saying that the Iranians are our neighbors, we can't push them out. We're going to have to learn to live with each other and try to strike some sort of agreement. So it's a pretty significant transformation.
Yeah,
for
that's
MBS.
also very helpful for regional peace and more reason why it's actually okay for us to withdraw. Gary, if I can get you to put that map back up there that shows where the U.S. troops are located throughout the region, and Dan, let me ask you. So, in your estimation, when you say that we should withdraw from the Middle East, do you mean like all those red dots should go away, or they should go down, or what do you view as the right mix of that?
Right. I would personally start with the most exposed areas. And of course, that's in Iraq and Syria, where U.S. troops, I believe the 3,400 in both combined in both countries, 900 in Syria and 2,500 in Iraq, as you see. They are the most exposed to rocket and drone attacks. And they're essentially being based in these very remote areas, small outposts, if you will. But those are the two areas I would personally work on first, because I think it's the easiest sell politically.
Yeah.
And then you would have to work your way into kind of consolidating your force structure into into very large areas in the Persian Gulf. And I should say, one of our friends and colleagues, Mike Sweeney, several years ago had a pretty good paper in defense priorities, essentially taking a look at how the zero option in the region would be implemented. And he goes through a very long list of how you could actually go from the 50,000 troops we have down to zero in the event that U.S. policymakers actually make that decision.
Yeah, but man, I think that's I want to say it's low hanging fruit, but as we're gonna see in a second, maybe it's not so low hanging fruit, but it's definitely the thing that's best for American national security interests right now is to get the troops out of Iraq and Syria for the obvious reasons that they're physically under attack while proving no value or benefit to the country at all. And I think that's an egregious misuse of our troops just on the surface of it. But getting them out of there is going to be a much bigger issue, even when you can make a pretty strong case, both strategically and tactically, that they need to come out. In 2019 and 2020, actually going back to 2018 was the big one. Trump tried to get Syria out. He actually announced that he was withdrawing all the troops from Syria. And predictably, a lot of people in Washington went crazy.
National Security Advisor John Bolton speaking to Israeli leaders over the weekend, and he appears to really contradict something that the president says. He says that, not to worry, that U.S. troops will not be pulled out of Syria until after ISIS is defeated. And we know what the president said was, he wanted to do it in 30 days because ISIS has already been defeated, right? And I know he sort of massaged that statement a little bit later on, but we've kind of seen this movie before, Major, where the president says something or tweets out something and then members of his cabinet are sort of dispatched to clarify, if not directly contradict what he said. Who are we to believe here?
It's just fast-moving or actually slow-moving confusion.
Because after all, Mattis left over this decision, which we all sort of thought was firm. Clearly he thought was, I presume, thought was firm too, and now it seems to be
as
mutating.
You pointed out, Major, and as Anne-Marie says, Secretary Mattis resigned over this, but it sounds to me what John Bolton is doing is what other members of the administration, as you point out, have always done. In other words,
seen the Secretary of State do it in North Korea.
Mattis could have probably said, you know what, yes, Mr. President, we're going to do it based on what you've pronounced on Twitter or whatever, but done what Bolton is doing now.
So that's what happened during Trump's cuts. And who knows whether the same kind of thing would happen in the Biden administration, at least to that degree, especially from within. But within is not the only problem. There's also the issue across the other side of the road there in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill.
I'm distressed to be on the floor of the Senate today with my colleague, Senator Graham, to express our deep and profound disappointment in President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northeast Syria. We had the opportunity to visit Syria this summer, and we saw what a difference our troops had made there in the fight against ISIS and stabilizing northeast Syria along the Turkish border.
So you see, she continued on that line of logic, and of course, we can't leave because of and fill in the blank. All these kinds of things will fall apart there. What would you tell members of Congress or even the administration to try to alleviate some of those fears? And just being raw politically, do you think that there's any prospect that if Biden did wake up in the morning and said, you know what, DePetris is right, man, that explainer sold me. We need to get him out there. How would he be able to navigate the issue within the administration and at Congress?
You know, I hate to strike a very pessimistic note here, but I honestly don't know if the president, even if he were interested in withdrawing troops from Iraq and Syria, which he's repeatedly stated he's not interested in doing that. But if he made that decision, you know, the institutional inertia in response to it would be tremendous. And like we saw it with that clip with Trump wanting to get out, essentially wanting nothing to do with Syria anymore, and the institutional status quo, the bias in favor of the status quo. It's a very, very difficult mountain to climb. And it's one of the reasons why U.S. troops were in Afghanistan for so long, quite frankly. And as a former vet who's fought in Afghanistan, you have personal experience of what I'm talking about. You know, once we establish a mission and we achieve our objectives, we don't leave. That's the problem. We decide to we don't admit that we've succeeded in accomplishing our objectives. Instead, what we do is raise the bar to entirely new objectives that, if we're being honest with ourselves, are probably unattainable or require an extreme amount of investment in personnel and equipment and manpower and everything else, time, political will. So that's the big conundrum that people like us have been facing for, well, as long as we've been alive, I guess, right, Danny? And it's a constant fight, and we have to continue explaining to people that matter that, you know, look at the broad picture. Do we really need to expend resources when, by simple cost-benefit analysis, the scale is grossly overweighed in favor of the costs?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of that analysis going on. There's just so much emotion. And like you said, because that's just kind of how it's been, we don't ever leave anywhere. We always stay until, you know, the thing just falls apart, like whether in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. And I just fear that we're, you know, on a path here, which I know was part of the motivation to even publish this, is because we don't want any troops to die pointlessly, as they did, you know, in some of these issues where we stayed too long. There's got to be some point, Dan, to where even through the emotion, some of our leaders can come to the point to say, this doesn't make any sense anymore. This is now a situation we're spending a lot of money. This is one of the other things I wanted to point out from your piece there. I thought was really instructive, is that it's not a low cost prospect. People say it's a low cost issue to be able to do, to be able to stay here. And you say it's not really a low cost. There's a lot of cost involved with this.
Right. It's extremely costly to the personnel who are ordered to basically implement a mission that's going on and on and on without no end in sight. There's a personal cost. There's a cost of getting involved in sectarian issues and local political dynamics that we should not be getting involved in. And there's, of course, a cost to U.S. troops themselves who may be eventually on the receiving end of a fatality in the event that, you know, a drone or a missile crashes into a U.S. outpost, in which case we would have to respond, in which case the escalation dynamics go up even more than they have been over the last 2 months.
Yeah,
so I think certainly not low
the
cost.
biggest potential cost is it's an ongoing cost on all the categories you just mentioned here, but the potential cost of that is just horrific. Number one, because of losing a trooper or other soldiers unnecessarily. But then there will be screams that, you know, you can't withdraw now. You can't just leave after you've had some people killed, because then that really would be a bad message. So you're going to have to respond, and it's going to have to be some strong way. And of course, Lindsey Graham and many others are saying it needs to be a hard one in Iran, on the IRGC, et cetera, which almost necessarily will have to be responded to by Iran. And then we have the whole escalation ladder risk that could suck us into a war. And as I think you point out in this piece also, if we thought the Iraq war was bad, that ain't nothing compared to what would happen if we get sucked into a war in Iran. Right. And, you know, the people that make the argument that we have to strike Iranian territory or Iranian military installations to deter Iran's proxies from launching attacks against our forces, it seems like they were asleep in 2020 when the United States literally assassinated Qasem Soleimani. And the Iranians responded within 48 hours to 72 hours by launching a bevy of ballistic missiles on 2 U.S. facilities in Iraq. And by the grace of God, thankfully, no U.S. troops were killed in that scenario. So
but you can bet your bottom line that if a soldier was killed, the escalation dynamics would be considerably high, and Trump would even a Trump who did not like U.S. troops in the region writ large, he would respond in a very forceful way.
Yeah,
so we're playing with fire here, Danny, and I know you've been making that point for 5-6 years now. I hope this paper kind of serves as sort of a big flashing red light that if we don't change our position and our policy writ large, we could be in some very serious trouble. Because right now, the only thing that's stopping U.S. troops from dying is luck. And basing your policy on luck is not a good proposition.
That is a bad thing to place the strategy on, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. We will leave it right there, Dan, and we thank you so much for coming on and giving some some clarity to this issue here and providing more information that hopefully decision makers in Washington can start realizing. And we pray to God that it's before we get into a situation where we have to make these war and peace decisions that would not be in America's national interest. We thank you for coming on, and we will look forward to having you on back, and enjoy your time in Mexico.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
And that's all we got for you today on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We continue to be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you all the information you need, the real information, the truth, to make sense of your world. And so when you hear things outside that don't line up with the truth, you know where to come to get the information here. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends, especially at this time of giving. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Deep Dive.